address those problems from a different perspective. So I left the practice of law, started my shura, trying to address these issues from a different angle, more in a preventive way or resolving disputes in a more amicable fashion than typically for litigation. But what we're here today to talk about is Islamic inheritance, estate planning, and how we as Muslims can make sure that both our Islamic obligations and our legal obligations are fulfilled. And that's a tricky mix of things to do. So, in order to talk about that more effectively, I've got an attorney on the line, Naveed Husain with Farooqi and Husain. Naveed has been practicing law for a few years now. He can talk about his background a little bit, but one of the main areas of practice that he does and he focuses on is this aspect of how do Muslims conform their estate plans, their Islamic wills with Islamic rules, and how are they effective in the United States. So Naveed, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you do it?
Sure. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So my name is Naveed Husain. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing now for about 8 years. And my area of focus is family law. And family law kind of breaks down into two pieces. I would say one is divorce law, and the other is estate planning. So obviously divorces deal with families, deal with children, assets, and the like. And then estate planning is, wills, estate trusts, advanced directives, and things like that. And what I really enjoy about what I practice is that both divorce law and estate planning law have a very big interface with Islamic law. And so I stay in touch with scholars. Both Ausaf and I are affiliated with Darul Qasim. We're both students at Darul Qasim. And so, we really like to research and see how can we integrate Islamic principles here in the West. So when it comes to divorce, for example, mahar issues, or when it comes to estate planning, making sure that we fulfill the requirements of Surah An-Nisa and the Sunnah in relation to wills. So that's kind of a little bit of a background of what I do and my practice area.
All right. So we're going to talk a lot about this concept of Islamic inheritance rules. And just before, Naveed breaks down the legal aspects of it and what that entails and how that involves us, I wanted to kind of go over some of those Islamic ideals first, because they set the tone for all of this. I think that sometimes growing up in the West, we don't realize what Islamic inheritance rules really impose upon us as believers. In the West, we have this context of inheritance, whereas if we were to receive inheritance from somebody, that's a gift, that's a blessing, that's a awesome sort of thing that we didn't expect. Sort of like, oh, great, my uncle passed away and he left me $100,000 in a trust. I feel really happy and privileged to receive those funds from my uncle. That's the concept that we have growing up here, because the idea is that inheritance is this almost gift that members of our family leave to us when they leave this earth. Islam treats inheritance very differently. In Islam, it's an obligation for the one who is passing away and a right of the one who is receiving. So what that means is that, for example, when my father passes, I have a right to certain funds from him, and he has an obligation to make sure those funds get to me. If he does not provide me those funds, or if any way those funds get obscured from getting into my possession, then my father owes me a debt. And that's a really important thing to understand. And it goes right back to understanding what is property in Islam. While we possess property in Islam, it's an imana, it's a responsibility from Allah. He's provided us this risk that we hold on to during our lifetime. The moment our life is extinguished, this risk belongs to somebody else. And it is our obligation to make sure that our risk, whatever Allah has put into our possession and in our responsibility, gets to whoever it's supposed to get to. So Naveed had referenced Surah An-Nisa, and within the Quran and within the Sunnah and within the the jurisprudence of Islam, there is this field of Islamic inheritance laws, which really break down and dictate exactly what has to happen in terms of our wealth going to our beneficiaries. Um, I don't want to make this a long expose about Islamic inheritance laws, so I'm going to be very brief about this. Just a few concepts that you should understand. The first concept is that when we're talking about the wealth that you have when you pass away, it gets distributed in a certain order. So the first thing that's going to happen from that wealth is that it's going to be distributed to pay certain immediate expenses and certain debts and obligations you have to individuals. So the debt you owe to people, those have to be paid upon your passing. Naveed can tell us about how there's all sorts of ways in the law that you could avoid paying those debts, but that's not going to absolve you in front of Allah as far as those debts being owed. Once we get through all of the initial expenses of the estate, there's what's remaining, that remainder of what you own, your wealth. And that gets distributed in three different fashions. You're allowed to distribute 1/3 of that, up to 1/3, however you like, with some limitations. One of those limitations is that this portion cannot be given to change anyone's expected inheritance amount. So what happens is that after we go through this 1/3 that's elective, there are individuals who receive a particular portion of your estate, and there are individuals who receive the residuary, whatever's remaining after those portions. So those percentages cannot be changed by this 1/3. And I'll explain that towards the end here, what I mean by that. And then there are a difference of opinion among the scholars, whether this 1/3 constitutes a gift or whether this 1/3 constitutes an inheritance. If it constitutes an inheritance within your definition, then it cannot go to somebody outside of Islam. If it's considered a gift from your estate, then it could go to anybody that you designate. So that's something that you'll want to check with your local scholar, whoever it is that you follow, and make sure that whatever you do set up conforms with what your beliefs are with respect to that. So after that 1/3 elective portion, what happens next is there are individuals who receive a particular share. For example, your father and your mother, provided that you have children, would receive 1/6 of whatever you own when you pass away. These percentages change depending on who's alive and who's passed away. Your spouse might receive anywhere between 1/2 to 1/8, depending on whether it's a husband or wife, depending on whether there's children. So that's going to vary. So they receive a particular portion. Once they all receive their portion, there's something called the residuary of your estate, whatever is left over. And that's been divided among a class of heirs that are known as your residuary heirs. So if you have children, if you have a son, your sons and daughters become your residuary heir. If you don't have a son, then your daughter shares a portion and your father becomes your residuary heir. If you don't have a son or a father, then your siblings become your residuary heir, provided you have a brother. So it's going to keep on changing depending on who is alive at the time of your passing. It could go to grandparents, it could go to grandchildren. So it really depends on exactly who's alive. And so when we're talking about those shares, so for example, if you have a spouse and you have children, and you want to know what does my wife get out of my estate? So she would receive 1/8 of your wealth if you have children. So you cannot use that wasiyah, that 1/3 elective portion that we talked about in the beginning. You can't use that to increase that 1/8 portion. So these are things all to keep in mind. And then getting away from the particular rules, something that we often forget is that our inheritance to the world is more than just our wealth. It's also our children. It's also the lessons we want to impart upon individuals. So one thing you want to do when we're talking about making sure that I have prepared for leaving this earth and I have done what I needed to do in terms of my property and my debt obligations. We also want to make sure that you've done what you need to do with respect to young children. You've done what you need to do to prepare those who will be stepping in to raise those children. Or if you have adult children, that you've left lessons for them so that they can understand and learn from you. Perhaps you're going to pass before they reach a point in their life where they need that advice from you. So you want to keep these things in mind, and you want to impart this inheritance, this wisdom upon your family members. This is part of what is in this greater concept of providing an Islamic inheritance. So let's say, Naveed, someone hasn't gotten an Islamic will done. They haven't had an estate plan. They haven't talked to a lawyer. With respect to the Islamic inheritance rules, these things I described, what happens if they pass away in the U.S. without doing anything?
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to start. So when it comes to somebody passing away without having a will done, then your assets will be distributed according to state law, otherwise known as intestate law. So each state has decided a generic model of how they want people's assets to pass or to be distributed. And so your assets would then be distributed according to state law. And obviously those state laws are not in accordance with Islamic principles at all. For example, there's nothing in any state that would have your parents inherit from you. For example, if you have a wife and children. And I think the other issue that is really big when it comes to not having a will is understanding joint property. And I know we'll probably get back to this a little later, but understanding that when you have joint property, when a husband and wife own a piece of property jointly, when husband passes away, it belongs to wife 100% under state law. And so in that regard, your asset does not get distributed according to Islam either. So not only do we have to let the courts know how we want our assets to be distributed with a will, for example, but also we really have to think critically about, the pros and cons of having joint property.
All right. And so, you're talking about estate planning. You're talking about, the tools that you would use. So what does that term mean? What does it mean to estate plan?
Sure. So estate planning is, in a simple way, how do we get your assets to the next generation as simply, efficiently, and by saving taxes and costs as quickly as possible, right? So there's a number of tools that we can use for quote unquote estate planning, right? And one of the other things that we kind of forget about estate planning is not only what happens after you pass away, but also thinking about what happens if, God forbid, you become incapacitated or you have a coma and you're unable to make decisions. What happens to your property in that circumstance as well? So, estate planning is kind of looking at each asset and figuring out, okay, what's going to happen to this asset after I pass away, and then implementing certain tools like wills and trusts to accomplish your goals.
So what kind of tools do you use? I mean, you mentioned wills and trusts. So, I mean, I think most people have a concept of what a will is, but, when you start getting into different kinds of tools, what's available for what do you use in estate planning, and what's the purpose of those items?
Sure. So I think the very first document that we all need to have as a Muslim, it's required on every Muslim. I mean, there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he said that if you have anything to bequest, you should not go more than 2 days without making a will. And one of the things that I wanted to add to Ausaf's discussion about Islamic inheritance is that there is a difference between wasiyah and mirath. Okay. So what Ausaf was discussing and what he was talking about, the 1/3 portion, that is our wasiyah, meaning that's what we are allowed to dictate. And that's kind of what we think about. But we tend to ignore the mirath part, which is what is automatically given to the other individual. So in Muslim countries, your mirath is set for you, right? So if you don't have a will, your mirath is going to happen, inshallah. However, here, the mirath, quote unquote, or the system that the state is going to use is un-Islamic. So kind of peeling back, the first document that I would use for every single person is a will. That's a very foundational document. And this will is going to address a few very important points. First of all, it's going to address who's in charge, who's your executor, who's going to take control of the situation, deal with the banks, deal with the property, deal with the court system if need be, and to ensure that your property is distributed the way that you want it to be distributed. So if you don't have a will, for example, that's kind of left up in the air. Who's going to take charge, right? The second thing that's going to be in a will is how you want your property to be distributed, okay? And so, again, this is our opportunity as Muslims living in America, that we do have the freedom to create documents, to create contracts, to create wills However, we want to create them. And this is our opportunity to use Islamic principles and Islamic fractions and have it as part of our wills. So in that particular section is where we can denote how we want our assets to be distributed, and we can use the Islamic principles. Again, I just want to caution everybody that there's two things to keep in mind, right? Just by having a will doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be distributed Islamically, right? Because again, we have to think about joint property. And number two is we have to think about those accounts, for example, retirement accounts or 401ks or IRAs that have beneficiaries, because joint accounts and those accounts with beneficiaries pass before the will even comes into place, right? So we can get into that discussion a little later.
Well, let me ask you about the will a little bit. Just so you know, you mentioned the last will and testament, and you're talking about the things that it can and can't do in terms of inheritance. And you mentioned some of the issues with the will not doing it, not being able to be the complete tool to make sure the inheritance guidelines are followed. So what are some of the scenarios that a last will and testament is not going to be sufficient in order to make sure that everything is dictated according to Islamic principles?
I think, kind of what I was talking about to begin with is that if you have, again, and I'll keep on mentioning this, but if you have joint property and you believe, for example, when a husband and wife owns a piece of property and it's jointly owned on the title, okay? And at this point, you have created a will and you are saying in your will that I want 1/8 to go to my wife, I want 1/6 to go to my mom, I want 1/6 to go to my dad, and I want the remainder to be split amongst my children in the Islamic manner. However, if you pass away, because you have a joint owner, they become 100% owner of that property. And now that 1/6, 1/8, all of those things aren't going to take effect.
Okay. So, what's the court process that deals with all this? And how does that function? Like, how does the property get into the will or stay out of the will? How does that all function together?
Sure. So before we address it, I just wanted to finish up my point about wills. So, we talked about executor, distribution. The third thing is funeral and burial rights will be mentioned in the will. And number 4, which is also very important, is guardianship. Who's going to take care of your children if husband and wife were to pass away? So, getting to the next point about how does the will work, practically speaking. So when somebody passes away, their executor is going to take this will to court, okay? And just like there's criminal court or divorce court, there's a particular system that Ausaf has alluded to called probate court. And the point of probate court is to ensure that the will is valid. And it's really the court is supervising to make sure that the executor is doing his job. So the executor goes to court, shows the will to the judge. Judge says, okay, looks good. Come back in 6 months or 1 year and prove to me that each and every aspect of this will has been taken care of. So that's really what the probate process is for. So the will is actually telling the probate court what to do.
So just so I understand, so what you're saying is that, say I own a house with my wife and I pass away, that house never goes into probate court, it just goes to my wife, so the will has no effect on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what do I do in that scenario where I have joint property with my wife and I want to make sure that my Islamic obligations are fulfilled and it's not going through that process? What are my options then?
So I think this kind of goes into a broader discussion where, I wanted to talk about obviously the technical aspects of estate planning, but I think this is also like a foundational issue that Muslims are facing in America is estate planning can't start, or it should start actually before you get married, right? Because fundamentally the concept of property and joint property in Islam versus how it's used in America is very different, right? So before you get married, you should actually have a conversation with your wife about, okay, this is the property that I own, this is the property that you own, or even if you do decide that you own property 50-50, that's fine. But really the problem comes in when you have property that's owned 100% by wife and 100% by husband. So in this circumstance, when you have joint property, you are the way that the law describes it is that you each own it 100%. So one thing we can do to kind of address this issue is, number one, yes, start from the very beginning. Before you get married, having prenuptial agreements to dictate whose property is who. If it's after that, then maybe what we do as estate planning attorneys is maybe we create a trust. And I think this is a good place for us to kind of talk about a trust, because one of the primary reasons that we use a trust is for, number one, avoiding the probate process, right? So basically anything that's part of a trust or that is owned by a trust would bypass that court process that we're talking about. But the other thing that we can do with a trust is we can create a trust for husband and we can create a trust for the wife. And at this point, we've created two separate buckets, and we can put husband's property in his trust. We can put wife's property in his trust. The other thing that we can do with the marital home is we can still have it where 50% of that house is owned by one trust and 50% of the house is owned by the other trust. And that still allows us to accomplish the Islamic inheritance rules.
Okay. What you mentioned something about guardianship of the children with the last will and testament. What happens if you don't have a will and you have young children?
That's a very interesting question, and it it's very important. So there's a number of things that could happen. So if husband and wife pass away, the children are still under 18. Basically, they are left with no guardian, right? There's no one in charge of enrolling them in school. There's no one in charge of taking them to their doctor's appointments or anything else like that. And there's no one to manage the money that you've left behind for them. So in that circumstance, what can happen is that people can start petitioning the court. Okay. So it might be that, okay, your siblings petition the court. It could be that your parents or your uncles, I mean, really, it could be anyone can petition the court at that point. And, you might get lucky and have somebody that you trust, somebody whose values you agree with, to petition the court, and hopefully they end up with the guardianship. But at the same time, it can end up bad, right? Because if there's an individual who understands that this child now comes with some money, they might be motivated to petition the court and really fight through to get guardianship of your children, because they understand by getting the children, they have access to the money as well. So for that fact alone, for that one reason alone, is why we all need wills, to make sure that we pick our guardians and that the state, the judge, some random guy doesn't pick who our guardian is.
I think one of the interesting aspects of what you're saying is this idea of, two interesting aspects. One is this idea of having these conversations in advance and having this dialogue regarding who owns what and planning for these things. And the second thing, this idea of these conflicts arising from not doing the right thing, so to speak. And just to speak on that for a second, in what I do as a mediator, my job is to resolve conflicts. And I think one thing that I've always noticed that's shocking for my clients is that they'll always say, well, I never thought this would happen. We're all family. I never thought that we would be at odds, sitting at a table, having lawyers around us, because this is my brother, this is my father, this is my son. How did we get here? And I think that one thing that I recall, and one thing that we should all be kind of aware of, is that if you look at probate court, if you look at divorce court, if you look at a lot of these disputes that people have, they're all family members. They're all people who were very close at one time, and now they're in open conflict with one another. So how does the estate plan work to alleviate conflicts?
So I think, number one, you are now dictating what should happen, right? You are now dictating how your assets should be distributed. You are dictating who should take charge of your children. And the other thing that you can do with a trust is keep your property out of court, okay? With a will, you are giving jurisdiction to the court to now deal with that property and to kind of supervise the distribution of that property. However, with a trust, you are kind of taking your property out of the sight of the court and having your private trustee deal with that property. So instead of, people fighting about who's in charge, or fighting about, I paid this much towards the father's mortgage, or I paid this much towards my mother's health, concerns. You now have a document that everybody is bound by. It's a contract essentially. And that's going to dictate what happens to hopefully resolve disputes. And I think the other side of it too is that this kind of talks about getting to what Ausaf was saying about court is mostly family members fighting, right? Be it divorce court, estate planning, but also business court, right? Civil litigation. A lot of that is mom and pop, or, brothers and cousins who've gotten into business, and now there's, partnership disputes. So the process of planning and coming up with the will and the trust is the same idea and the same concept we should take when we do business, and making sure that we get operating agreements done and all of that. So simply by taking the time to discuss and putting on paper, I think in and of itself is what helps resolve conflicts and to help quell conflicts before they start.
So what I hear you saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I hear you saying is basically there's a two-part process to this. There's a part of the process where everyone sort of has to engage in on their own, within their own families, to start having these open and frank conversations about who owns what, about what should we do with our children if we're not both here, about how should our wealth be distributed, about just our Islamic obligations, even, you had mentioned from the onset of marriage for a couple to start talking about how they're going to own property or earn property or work during the marriage. It's really like prompting these very frank conversations that we kind of gloss over because they're not the simplest conversations to have. It's easier to avoid them. And then once you have those conversations, you come with some conclusions, sitting down with somebody such as yourself to really take that conversation and put it into effect.
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, that it's all about communication, right? Be it in your marriage, be it in your business, be it in estate planning. So many of our issues can be resolved with communication. And that also applies in estate planning, that having things on paper, being open about these items is absolutely necessary. And I think what happens when you go to a lawyer to do the estate planning, yes, you are going to end up with those documents. But like you said, it's really a two-part approach, because that lawyer is asking you questions that you and your wife or whoever need to go back and talk about and discuss and really decide and think about, okay, yes, this house is, how is this house owned? Who's going to take care of our kids? Okay, maybe you're not my sister because of XYZ reason, maybe because of my brother. And what we see also in divorce court, it's interesting, is so much of family issues arise in a divorce case, right? And the estate planning process, when now you have to pick which one of your siblings is going to be the guardian, for example, that's going to open up the doors that you need to actually work through when it comes to family issues and all of that. In this, unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, although I've seen a lot of increase in estate planning, I've also seen increase in people calling for divorce advice in terms of, I'm stuck at home with my in-laws, and I don't know what to do. And really, it's a lack of communication between husband and wife.
All right. So say I'm Muslim, I'm older, in the retirement phase of my life. All my kids are grown. I don't have a house. I don't have any significant assets. Living out a simple retirement. In that scenario, what do I need to make sure that I have fulfilled my Islamic obligations, and I can rest assured that, okay, if I pass away today or tomorrow, I've done what I needed to do to make sure that things went the way they had to go?
Yeah, I mean, first thing is definitely having a will. And then number two is, making sure that you have your healthcare powers of attorney, making sure that you have your durable power of attorney to deal with finances towards the end of the life. And then the other thing to understand is that making sure that your beneficiaries are listed properly on your retirement account the way that you want it to go. The other thing is that retirement money is also considered part of your estate. And that money should also be distributed according to Islamic principles. So the way to accomplish that is, number one, I don't necessarily recommend this, is to remove the beneficiaries, because then it would go into your estate, and then your will dictate how that property is distributed. Again, I don't really recommend that. Or number two is you could create a trust and now name your trust as the beneficiary of that retirement account. And then that money would go through the trust and then be distributed Islamically speaking. So at the very least is absolutely will. So I'm not sure if this is what you're trying to get at, but basically if you have no money, even if you have $1, that's enough for you to get a will done, simply said.
All right. And then what if I'm sort of starting out my life and I haven't necessarily gotten to the phase where I have a whole lot of wealth. Maybe I'm on my first or second job after college, newly married, maybe one or two young children, and I'm just starting out. What is your recommendation, or what would generally be your thoughts on somebody in that scenario? They're young, so they might not be thinking about their mortality at that time. What are some of the things you would speak to if that was your client sitting in your office?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would commend them for sitting in my office, right? Because, unfortunately, young people don't come to the office as much, and they only tend to come if they're going for Hajj or they're going out of the country somewhere. So, number one, I would commend them. And then, I think that in that scenario, again, I think it's important to build the foundation, okay, of what the future is going to come. So first of all, the will, but second of all, really is to also think about the trust here again, right? Because in the beginning, I mentioned that the reason people use a trust is to avoid probate, right? But another very big reason that people use trusts is to protect money for their children, okay? So in this scenario that you mentioned, there's two young children, okay? And there's a very long way for them to go until they turn 18, let's say, or, something else. So what we can do with the trust is actually have this money, God forbid, if husband and wife were to pass away, we can have the money sit in a trust, and now this money is going to be managed by somebody else. So it doesn't come into necessarily the control of the children, but it's being managed by a third party. And then depending on, when financial maturity is, then we can have that money released to them. So in that scenario, I would really advise them to create a trust for the sake of the children, right? Because if husband and wife were to pass away, then somebody else can manage that money on behalf of the children. And they're not necessarily getting a whole bunch of money when they're still young. The other reason why I would mention a trust for these individuals is when you create a trust, you've created kind of a foundation. And as you add more properties and more investments to your portfolio, now instead of buying those properties in your own name, you can start buying these properties in the name of the trust. And again, by having these things end up in the trust, they go through the funnel and being managed on behalf of your children. And number two is that you can avoid probate. So that's what I would say to that particular couple.
All right. So, if I'm browsing around about estate planning, going on the internet, reading about it, there's another term that often comes up in conjunction with estate planning, and that's asset protection. What is asset protection from your perspective? And is that something that should be included in everything we're talking about today?
Sure. Yeah. So asset protection is very closely related to estate planning, right? Like I said before, estate planning is, getting your assets to the next generation quickly and efficiently. But asset protection also adds the clarification of protecting your assets so that it can go to the next generation, right? And so the basic concept or the basic principle that I like to share is that the more control you have over your property, the more chances that if you get sued or something happens that people can grab that money. And then on the other side of it is that the less control you have, the less likely individuals are able to get that money if they were to sue you, right? So in this regard, there's a few tools that we can use for asset protection. Number one is creating LLCs. Okay, that's a very easy way for us to kind of shield other assets. So a lot of Muslims in our community have rental properties. We love to, for some reason, we love to invest in real estate. It's a great investment. But what ends up happening is that, we'll end up with 5, 6, 7, 8 rental properties. And yet all of these properties, along with your actual house, is owned in your own name, right? And so if somebody sues you as an individual, now they have access to all of the properties in your name. So one easy thing that we can do is we can create an LLC or separate LLCs to have these properties each owned by a separate LLC. So if somebody in that particular house slips and falls and now they're suing you, they only have access to that little bubble and not access to the rest of it, right? That's one easy way that we can do things. The other way that we can do asset protection is irrevocable trusts, okay? And irrevocable trusts can be used to take property out of your name, but still benefit your heirs. So for example, if I had a rental property, I can put into an irrevocable trust, have Ausaf be the trustee of that trust and tell him, hey, Ausaf, I'm giving you this property, but I want you to take care of it for the benefit of my son, okay? And his job then would be to manage that property, to do whatever he needs to do to benefit my son. I don't have control over it, and that's the principle of asset protection, but at the same time, it's still benefiting my family. There's other things that we can do with irrevocable trust, for example, charitable lead trust and charitable remainder trust. Basically, we can take advantage of taxes by sending property, or let's say a brokerage account, into an irrevocable account, have the income generate from that, use it to donate to charity, and we get the tax deduction. And once we pass away, we can have that property go however we want. So those are the primary two tools that I would use in asset protection. But the third is not really a tool, but to have an umbrella policy, right? When it comes to insurance, right? You can talk to your Islamic scholar about this. I'm not giving a fatwa here, but looking at insurance to look at the concern of being sued and protecting your assets.
Okay. And, you mentioned that this is kind of work that you've been doing for a while in terms of bringing the Islamic aspects into the legal world of estate planning. So if someone was going to come and sit with you regarding their estate plan, or have a conversation with you about that, what's different from your perspective of your practice as opposed to that same brother or sister going to any estate planning lawyer that just looks up and look up on Google and find somebody? What's the difference there?
I mean, I think there's a lot of difference. I mean, number one is being Muslim, being from the subcontinent, growing up in Chicago. I mean, I understand the cultural aspects of, how property is acquired and how property is usually distributed. For example, our mothers, for some reason they have all this jewelry, and now this jewelry, this belongs to my bahu and this belongs to my daughter-in-law. And, there's a whole conglomeration and a whole scheme of how their jewelry is supposed to be distributed. And if they don't have a will, if they don't have anything, that's not going to happen, number one. Number two is that there's a clash there now between the cultural expectations of how your jewelry is, divided versus Islamic law. So I'm able to help them kind of resolve the tension between the two. I think the other thing as well is just advising people on how their property should be distributed Islamically, right? And I think that growing up in Chicago, having connections to, let's say, Dar es-Salaam or Dar al-Qasim or whatever, to connect people to scholars to make sure that their questions are being answered when it comes to estate planning. I think the problem is that when you go to a non-Muslim attorney, for example, all of this is foreign to them, and they're going to spend more money probably calling me as a consultant to teach them about how this works, and the different layers of all of that. The other thing is that I'm familiar with out of country assets, out of state assets. A lot of our clients have assets in India, for example, or Pakistan, or they have assets in the Middle East, and so we can take that into account when we're doing our estate planning as well.
Have you tailored your documents in any way that's different from how an attorney would tailor their documents to properly incorporate the Islamic inheritance rules?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question. So, I remember a few years ago, ISNA had like a template that they were giving out to people and telling them, okay, use this to sign your wills. Or even if you go online, you'll find templates. The problem that I see with those wills and those templates is they're really verbose about Islamic law. And, there's a preamble that says, I bear witness There is no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and all of that is fine, right? But not in a will, right? Because this will is going to go to court and a judge is going to review it. And if a judge now thinks that we're trying to implement Sharia law, in the court system, it might not fly, right? So the way that I do my estate planning, or the way that I write my wills, is without making reference to Islam itself. Rather, I'm taking the principles, the fractions that Islam tells us, and I'm putting that into the will. So if there was somebody who was going to read your will, they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that the distribution model is based off of Islam. Rather, there's just fractions going on. So that's kind of the difference of how I handle my verbiage.
All right. And what are some of the challenges and obstacles that your clients have faced in terms of trying to make sure that their inheritance goes the way they want it to go? And how have you sort of addressed some of those concerns?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern that our clients have is when they realize the percentages. For example, like, if wife passes away, 1/4 goes to husband, or if husband passes away, 1/8 goes to wife, right? And what tends to happen is that people try to come and they spend hours, emailing me back and forth, or we'll have a conversation about what are different ways that we can avoid it. So at one point, they're coming in telling me that they want an Islamic estate plan, but at the same time, now they're trying to negotiate with me on how do we get around the Islamic laws, right? And although there might be legitimate ways to do that, I think that we have to see where that's coming from, right? And so, for example, I've heard of people increasing their meher and saying that, okay, my meher is, it was $10,000 when we got married, but now to account for 50% of my property, I'm going to make the meher $200,000 and keep that as a debt so that my wife gets 50% of the property. I don't think that's the right approach. I think the right approach is to address, okay, even if even if the wife earned all of the money, for example, it's still important for the two of you to divide that money during your lifetime to truly implement Islamic principles. Again, the joint property thing, I think, is a huge obstacle to get through when we're truly trying to implement Islamic inheritance rules, because that really throws everything off. And the problem is that 99% of us have our bank accounts and our homes owned jointly with our wives. So I would say that the two biggest obstacles I see is people coming saying they want an estate plan, but then trying to figure out ways to get around it, the Islamic principles. And then number two is joint property.
Okay. And, you and I were talking earlier, and you had mentioned something about doing estate plans through video conference. How does that work? Is that something that is available to individuals? What's that all about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So typically speaking, when you have a will done, there's a lot of formalities that take place, right? You have to have that will signed in person in the presence of two witnesses. And those two witnesses have to be disinterested, meaning that they're not part of your family. However, based off of the state shutdown, here in Illinois, I'm not sure in other states, but here in Illinois, they're temporarily allowing us to do estate plan signings through video, through Zoom, just like we're doing here. So that's why I think another reason why we've seen such an increase, that now we're getting clients from Rockford, from Springfield, from different areas getting their estate plans done, because we can now do it through Zoom calls. But this is only temporary. So long as the state shutdown is going to go, that's as long as the video is going to go. So, I mean, honestly, that's until the end of the month as of right now.
So when you mention state shutdown, you mean the state shutdown due to the COVID pandemic, right?
Exactly, yes.
All right. So basically right now, if I'm living in Moline or Carbondale, I have the ability to take advantage of an attorney in the Chicago area through this vehicle. I don't have to drive 5 hours or 4 hours to sit in your office. What you're telling me is that I can just pick up the phone, call you, and go through the process in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very simple process. I mean, we've done it so many times now. And, technologies like this have really enabled us to make it really easy. You print out the documents at home. You literally put your ID up to the camera. The witnesses view you signing the documents, and you're done. You just mail the documents back to us within 30 days, and you have a valid estate plan at that point.
So, considering the importance of the Islamic will, why not just go on to one of these online services, throw your data in, have it spit out a will, and sign it? Why come talk to you or talk to any other attorney? And just
I think you kind of cut out a little bit.
I'm saying that, you hear me okay right now?
A little bit better, but it's still like a.
All right. Well, hold on 1 second. Let me just. Good now?
Yeah, I think that's better.
Okay, cool. So, I was just asking, considering the importance of the Islam.
Yeah, I think Ausaf cut out for a little bit. Yeah, I'm sure he'll join back in. I mean, I think what I was getting from the question was why, we know that wills are very important, so why not go online and simply download a will from online, or go to these other websites that allow us to just print out a will and sign it, and kind of go from there. So I think the major problems that I see with online wills is, number one, is that it's very generic. Okay. And these people are these sites that are going to have you print out their wills and print out their documents. You can't go after them if something bad was to happen. For example, as an attorney, I have my malpractice insurance. For example, if something bad were to happen, that or I didn't do things properly, that you have some type of recourse if your wishes were not fulfilled. However, with these online platforms, you have no recourse, right? And you don't know that those things are not valid for many, many, many years later, number one. Number two is, what I've seen is that a lot of times people download the templates from online, and they pay the money, but they never have it signed. And that's another big problem. Oh, Ausaf, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just going based on your question about why we shouldn't use online wills. And the second point I was mentioning is that many times what happens is that we pay for these online wills, we print it out, but we never have them executed. I mean, there's no attorney who's pushing you to make sure that you sign these wills and have it actually valid. Honestly, if you pay for that will, you print it out and it's just sitting on your desk, that's not a valid will. It has no weight whatsoever. And number three is, those online wills is only a will, right? It's not going to give you a trust. It's not going to transfer property into a trust. So the more nuanced estate planning can't be done online. It's kind of, do I go to WebMD or do I talk to a doctor? That's kind of how I look at it.
So basically, part of the benefit of coming and talk to you about is just talking to you, having that advice, having that consult, hearing your feedback in real time with respect to their particular situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's custom tailored, right? Whereas these online wills are going to be kind of a broad, sweeping document that's very generic. Yeah.
All right. And, one of the things I want to remark on is during the time that I did practice law, it was almost 10 years. There was a case that I had at the very beginning of my legal career. It was about a year in, and it was my first probate matter. And one thing that I tried to do before I left the practice of law is I wanted to finish up all of my cases. Whatever case that I had been working on, I wanted to make sure they were all tied up. I had a couple of very complicated divorce litigations, and alhamdulillah, they were able to be tied up before I left the practice. But this one probate case, it was between two family members. It went on for my entire legal career, and it didn't get resolved before I left. So, I think one thing to kind of keep in mind is that some of these conflicts that can occur if you don't do an estate plan, They can cost you a lot of money, and they can last longer than your attorney's career. It's something just to keep in mind. These things can be devastating in all sorts of ways. So, I think that it's really an important thing to plan ahead. Um, Something that I've been telling a lot of my clients in almost every field, every aspect of what I do, whether business, personal, family, anything that I work in, is that it's important that you accomplish what is impossible when it's still possible. And for estate planning, what that means is that once you've passed away, anything you want to do is essentially impossible. You want the Sharia distribution? It's impossible because you're gone from this earth. It's up to your family members to do what they got to do now. And if they choose to do it, they might not. If they're going to fight, they're going to fight. Your ability to do anything about that has passed. It's now impossible. Whereas if you take care of it now, it's very possible. So, if you want to make sure that you've accomplished it correctly, you want to get in front of things. And that's something that I've focused on a lot with my business and personal clients, is to get in front of whatever adversities they have these difficult conversations, start talking about them. And these conversations might be really hard to have within your family. It's not easy for a husband and wife to start breaking down and talking about, well, how much of what we own is mine or yours according to Islam. You may want to talk to an imam or a local scholar regarding that question too. You may want to seek some kind of advice regarding how that should break down within your family. But once you start having this communication and these conversations, then it's important to, whatever your family decides upon, make it into effect, breathe it into existence. Because just because you think this way, that doesn't mean it is. There's a way to make it so that is what's binding. And that's where people like attorney Naveed Husain and other professionals like him are going to come in, is they're going to take those conversations and those communications that you have within your family, and they're going to make them into something that you can rely on, and that if you do pass away, you can make sure that your rights before Allah and your rights to your family are fulfilled.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that it wouldn't be smart of us not to talk about is, we've kind of talked about estate planning from an individual level, right? And I think really we need to look at the effects of estate planning on a societal level, right? Only with proper estate planning will we be able to establish the institutions that our community needs. Right now, what's happening is that we are building up our own assets. People are building up institutions, but we have no plan on how are we going to sustain this from an ongoing process. And I know that Ausaf talks about 501c3 sustainability and proper fundraising methodology, but I think that this is another important area to make sure that our non-for-profits are going to survive for generations to come, is making sure that if we do want to support a particular non-for-profit institution, that we create endowments, that we have our estate plans, our trusts, and our wills connected to these endowments, so that when we pass away, not only are we, leaving a legacy for our children, but we are leaving a legacy for these institutions. The only way that we are going to start having hospitals and, our own ACLUs and all these different, big institutions, is when people pass on and donate their money to these institutions. That can only happen through estate planning. The other thing from a non-profit perspective is getting away, and I know I'm taking Ausaf's phrasing here, but to get away from the one-off fundraising dinners and really concentrate on more sustainable methods. For example, establishing an endowment fund and encouraging your community to start donating and having their estate plans connect to these endowment funds. So from a societal level, that's kind of what I would say as it relates to estate planning. I don't know, Ausaf, if you've seen anything from your side of the societal impact of estate planning and how we can move our community forward. It seems that he may have been cut off as well. But really what the point of this presentation really should be of, number one, that we are living in a very interesting time, where things are shut down, where people are scared, and they're thinking about their mortality, right? And for some reason, Muslims tend to think about estate planning before they go to Hajj, because I guess they believe that's when they're going to pass away. But again, I think that this is a time for all of us to stop and reflect, and to think about our own mortality, and to start thinking about our estate planning, and think about what we're going to leave behind for our children, what we're going to leave behind for the Muslim community. And really, at the very least, even if we aren't going to get our trust done, or we don't, we're not trying to do anything complicated, at the very, very least, every Muslim household in America needs to have a will. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind in making that statement. The other thing too is to connect with our scholars. Our scholars have a vast amount of knowledge when it comes to estate planning, and to make sure that we take advantage of them and ask them about how our assets should be distributed, and the like. And I think the third thing that really what this conversation is supposed to bring to light is the importance of communication from the onset, not right before you pass away, but kind of starting right before you get married, right? Right before you start your life, to have that conversation with your family about how money is going to work, how property accumulation, property distribution, and how all of that is going to work. That was really what the goal of this presentation was. So I know also if you kind of cut off, I'm not sure if there were some other points that we missed here.
No, I mean, what I was supposed to do when we started this feed was I was supposed to let everybody know to post your questions in the Facebook stream, so that Naveed could answer those, but I forgot. So I'm not sure if anybody has any questions. Naveed, you could address those questions if they're there. What I'm going to do is try to throw up our contact information on the page. So if anybody does have questions, wants some feedback or some advice about any of this, you're going to be able to reach out to either Naveed or I. Obviously, anything legal related regarding your estate plan, really the person you contact is Naveed. He's the one who's going to be able to guide you on those things. So there's his contact information, his office, his email. And if you don't have questions right now, or if you're going to have those conversations with your family and then get back to Naveed, that's the email right there. And if you have questions about how to have those conversations in the first place and how to work out those problems within the family, that's basically what I do, is I try to help people have those difficult conversations, because my job is to make sure that you can get through life using lawyers as little as possible. No offense, Naveed. But that's what I do. So whatever questions you guys have, if you shot them over in Naveed, he can answer those now. Sure. Otherwise, just shoot us an email. We're happy to help you guys. One thing that both Naveed and I have always done in our careers is we enjoy educating the community. We want the community to know and understand these things. We want to empower you with these tools. So if you just want to shoot us a message with other things you want us to have webinars about, we're happy to go ahead, do the research, bring in the experts, and have conversations about those things as well. This new sort of forum that we're doing through e-conferencing, it's really helped open up our ability to communicate with the community and educate on a variety of topics. We've been doing this for years, and we plan to continue doing this. This is an important part of what we do as individuals, as volunteers, and as professionals. So anything you guys want to hear about, feel free to reach out.
So there were a few questions. So the first question is, what about out of state? So when it comes to out of state, I'm licensed in Illinois and Wisconsin. And so, what I've been talking about is kind of from the Illinois perspective. But again, the point is to reach out to those Muslims in your state. I know New York has a bunch of Muslim lawyers. I know California has a bunch of Muslim lawyers. I know there's Yasser Ali out in Arizona. And even if your particular state doesn't have a Muslim lawyer, I do provide consultation for other lawyers as well. So when there are lawyers in other states who don't know about Islamic law, you can point them towards me, and I can, kind of teach them the basics of Islamic inheritance.
And from what I recall, one thing that you do is you'll work with local counsel in different states on one-off basis. So if you're in Texas, if you're in California, you know, you've got contact with local councils who can help you work in collaboration to get the plan done.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. That yes, if you are from, you know, some of these major cities, I do have relationships there. I can point you towards those attorneys, and I work with those attorneys very closely to, you know, help accomplish your estate planning as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The other question was, Assalamu alaikum, can the will include instructions on last rites, meaning burial, etc.? So yes, that is one of the major sections of the will, is how do we, how should you be buried, and how should your funeral occur? So in our wills, for example, we make sure to mention that there should be no autopsies, there should be no embalming, that there shouldn't be like a big mausoleum created around your grave. You know, we mentioned that your body should not be flown across vast distances for burial, that you should be buried facing the Qibla, and buried without a casket, but if local laws require one, it should be modest. So yes, all of the last rites instructions are in the will, and it's very important for those of us who are not part of a Muslim family, right? So if we've converted to Islam and our family is not Muslims, it's very, very important to have this provision in your will to inform your family on how you want your funeral and burial to occur.
And that's a really common thing, is that, you know, we'll have a masjid or a community member reach out to us and say, well, this brother has passed away and his family is trying to bury him as a Christian. What can we do? And unfortunately, really the answer is you can go talk to the family and have a conversation. But if you haven't planned for it, there's not a whole lot that you can do.
Yeah. Another question was, what if I only have a house? So, you know, I kind of see what they're getting at. Like, do you need a trust just because you have a house? I mean, maybe, maybe not. And again, I'm not trying to give specific legal advice here. This is all informational purposes. But there is another tool that's available here in Illinois, and I'm not sure if it's available in other places. And for some reason, many attorneys don't use this tool. It's called a transfer on death instrument, okay, a TODI. And so what this document can do is it can target your house. So if you really have nothing left, and I see this a lot for the older generation where they've spent their life kind of paying off their house and everything's in their house now, and they really don't have much in their accounts, or, you know, their children kind of, you know, have control over that now. This is where you can use a transfer on death instrument. And basically what we're doing is that we are recording a deed with the county, and now the county is going to have notice of who you want that house to belong to after your passing, and that will avoid probate of your house. So that was a good question there. Another question was, what are the costs of estate planning? So it really depends on your situation, but me personally, I charge $350 per will, or $500 for a couple. And then depending on estate, you know, if we're doing trusts and other things, that can really depend. I mean, you're looking at about, you know, 2,000 to 3,000 for a trust. In terms of,
I had a quick question about the cost. So say I don't get the estate plan done. How much does probate typically cost me?
That's a good question. So the average probate cost for a middle-class family is about $3,500. That is really going to the attorney. And one of the interesting things about estate planning is that most of the industry is actually based off of attorneys making money. At the end of the day, the people who benefit most from these estate plan fights or from this litigation is the attorneys. So for an average person to take their case through probate is going to cost about $3,500. And already, just by having a trust, you know, you're going to save a little bit there. And number two, when I'm talking about $3,500, that's for an average family who only has one property. If you have multiple properties, the more and more properties you have, the more probate is going to cost. So it makes it more prudent for you to have a trust just by having an extra rental property or something like that.
And I remember from the litigation I had referenced earlier, that was a six-figure legal bill. So these things get expensive.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I have a question here. What are the steps to get my will done? So the steps are pretty simple. You know, we put our contact information up, but basically you can call, you can email, you can come to our website. And what I'd like to do first is have a conversation with you personally about your family situation, your financial situation. I'll learn about your assets. I'll learn about how your things are titled. And then I'll make a recommendation, right? Hey, and then I'll be really honest. And I know that other people, you know, kind of push for the trust in every single case, but I'm not like that, right? If I really think that you can get away with the will and maybe a transfer on death instrument as opposed to a trust, that's what I'm going to tell you. And I'll come up with a plan. I'll come up with a suggestion. Once we agree on a suggestion, there'll be a list of questions that go out. And then it takes me about a week to have everything drafted. Right now, because we're having video calls, we would schedule a Zoom call, and we can get the signing done at that point. So, you know, give us a call, or you could even email me, you know, at the email that's on the screen right now.
And make sure if you're getting your estate plan done, contact Naveed. No reason to contact me or CC on the email. I can't help you getting your estate plan done, and whatever you do with your attorney, I shouldn't be involved in that conversation.
Yeah. The other thing, let me see if there's any other questions here. Okay, somebody asked, what if I have a bank account only? So if you have a bank account only, again, it's going to depend on what your family situation is. But one thing you could do is, okay, number one, have a will. Number two is you could do something called a POD, payment on death. So you can go to your bank and tell them that I want this person to be the POD, right? The problem is that the banks will not let you make somebody under 18 a POD. So meaning you can't name your children as the POD. It would have to be somebody else entirely. So even if you have a bank account, again, the Islamic requirement of you having a will is still there. And then, you know, I would have to learn a little bit more about the family situation to figure out, can we get away with just a will, for example?
Yeah, and I think just to re-emphasize what Naveed said earlier, you know, the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that if you have anything to bequest, do not go more than 2 nights without a will. So the word is used as anything. So, you know, we want to understand that if we want to fulfill our Islamic obligations, living in this country, it cannot be done without a will. That's just the reality of what we face. If we live in a different country, if we live in a Muslim society under certain laws, then these things can be done without us taking that proactive step. But because we live here and because we've chosen to make our lives under these laws, there is a step that we all need to take. It doesn't matter how much we have or how little we have. That's something that we've all got to figure out.
Yep. I think those are all the questions that I can see in front of me. One request I'd like to make to everybody watching right now is to please share this on your timeline. You know, it's not about the firm. It's not about me or Ausaf. Really, it's about, you know, we want to establish the Sunnah, and inshallah, you know, have reward for me and Ausaf and our families to have this Sunnah established, right? So I'm asking all of you to please share this on your timeline. We really want this to become a field that more Muslim attorneys start, you know, practicing in, so that we can make sure that, you know, everybody has a will. And I remember, Ausaf, you know, that you had a story about CIOGC and how they did a survey. Can you kind of tell us that before we end?
Yeah, I remember this is going back in 2007. We did a survey of 100 Muslim donors, and part of that the questionnaires was talking about their estate plan. So going back about 13 years, we found that 70% of Muslim donors, and these are individuals who were wealthy, not individual, you know, these are people who actually donated large sums of money to different organizations, because we were trying to hone in on individuals who were donating large sums. 70% did not have a last will and testament. So only 30%, and only of those we surveyed, only one had any kind of trust set up. So that's actually what prompted me way back in 2010 to start doing estate planning seminars of my own. And now that I've hung up the legal world from my repertoire, that's really what Naveed does now, is he's reaching out and working on those things. And just, kind of echoing off of what Naveed said, one thing that we should all keep in mind is that it's understood that when Islam is going to leave this world, the first of the Islamic sciences that is forgotten is the science of inheritance. And it's something that we don't teach very much at all. So I think that by sharing this, by having this be a reminder to everyone in our community, we are in effect keeping this science alive and prompting our community to look into this science, learn about the science of Islamic inheritance, why we have it, what it is, how it dictates upon you, talking to your scholars, talking to your local community leaders, and seeing how this can benefit you and what your obligations are under these rules. We want you to look out for that information and to learn that information. So, just that reminder that this is supposed to be the first of the Islamic sciences to disappear. Let's not let it disappear. Let's share the information.
Awesome.
All right, so we're gonna wrap up now, inshallah. Again, if you have any questions for Naveed, his contact information is up on the screen. I thank you all for spending this time with us. I thank you all for listening, inshallah. And I hope that whatever you need, whatever education seminars you want, please reach out to us. And I look forward to working with everyone who's viewed this video. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. You're still recording.
It's still recording, but that's personal recording.